A man who viciously attacked a customer.
Unprovoked assaults.
It's super aggressive.
Terrifying attack. Oh, no.
Unexpected terror.
No! No!
You cannot put your kid in the damn trunk!
Is this a kidnapping?
And incredible bravery.
It was instinctual.
Chilling viral crimes.
If he had stayed in there, he would have died.
Caught on camera.
It's another senseless crime.
I couldn't believe it.
I started yelling, help me, help me.
I felt violated.
It's definitely a messed up scenario.
August 1st, 2022, Hollywood, California. After a busy afternoon at his restaurant, Tim Ratcliffe steps out to grab some pizza next door.
I go to have lunch with my girlfriend, and we went outside to sit down at the patio.
But then, something at another table catches his eye.
I couldn't believe that I was actually seeing what I was seeing.
A man comes out of nowhere to sucker punch someone.
He was just knocked violently to the ground.
It's like my worst nightmare. You're chilling, having a nice lunch outside, and somebody tries to assault you or rob you.
The assaulter snatches the man's wallet, then makes a run for it, with Tim right on his heels.
So many people in that situation would be more in shock, like unable to process what they just saw, but he leapt right into action.
I just reacted. It was instinctual. He sucker punches me and my glasses go flying. Then the wallet, the cell phone of the gentleman that was stolen also go flying.
Have Tim's impulsive actions put him in danger?
The worst case scenario is Tim trying to be the hero here, not realizing that he could be dealing with someone who was armed or more dangerous than he expected.
Tim does have one advantage. He's trained in martial arts.
I studied judo for 4 years in Japan. It's great for defense. It definitely comes in handy when you're a vigilante.
As the two men struggle, Tim's girlfriend and another bystander jump in to help.
She just sprung right into action.
My girlfriend, Olga, had to kick him a couple times because he's trying to bite me. Then she was stepping on his legs. As I tackled the guy, a little over $1,000 fell out of my pocket. I'd just gone to the bank to make change for the restaurant.
And Tim's girlfriend, not only was she collecting the stolen items, but she was also getting all Tim's money back.
People walking by and driving by were thinking that this is crazy. He was pleading with me, asking and begging that he won't do this again, and he's so sorry.
Tim and his girlfriend managed to hold the thief down until help arrives.
It lasted at least 10, 12 minutes that we were on the ground. Fire department showed up first. They did crowd control. It's probably one of the busiest intersections in Hollywood.
Police arrest 28-year-old Michael Austin Donna and charge him with felony robbery. He is sentenced to 3 years probation.
Tim saved the day by capturing this man. Sweet justice served.
Tim's heroics quickly go viral with almost 1 million views.
And caught on video the moment a Hollywood restaurant owner took down a man who viciously attacked a customer.
There was news station crews waiting in the parking lot of my restaurant for me. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. This went crazy viral.
Restaurant owner in Hollywood quickly jumped into action.
The 64-year-old victim, Richard Schlesinger, who broke his ribs when he fell to the ground, tells reporters he never saw it coming.
I mean, the guy cold cocked me. It was out of nowhere. I was there with my dog. I was like, well, what is this?
For Tim, the most upsetting part is that the man responsible for the attack is someone he knows.
Michael is a homeless person. He had been coming around the restaurant for a couple months at that point. We'd give him water, give him food, and 3 or 4 minutes beforehand, I had just gone up to him and asked him, do you need anything? He had told me no, he was just fine. I was so emotional about the situation, and I didn't want to believe that this happened.
One bright spot in all of it is that Tim and the man he defended have now become friends.
Richard came down to have a discussion with me and thank me, and we sat down for a good hour. He told me we became brothers, and I 100% agree that we were destined to become friends.
And Tim has no regrets about putting himself in harm's way.
And I would do it again in a heartbeat. There's no reason for having injustice in public.
But as this next clip reveals, when you deal with the public, you never know who is on the edge of violence.
Do you have anything on you? Anything sharp?
You can never judge a book by its cover.
Stay out of the car. Ma'am, do not get in that car! No!
November 6th, 2021, St. Paul, Minnesota. Just before midnight, a state trooper stops a woman for driving erratically in a construction zone. Something is off.
What are you doing? What are you doing?
Grandma, why are we acting like this?
It's almost midnight, and she's wearing sunglasses. That should have been the first red flag.
What are you doing?
I'm trying to find my way out.
Okay, this is a one-way.
Yeah, but do I go down this lane or that lane?
For a moment, it seems as if the woman is innocently confused.
This is a one-way?
Yeah. Do you have your driver's license on you?
But dispatch warns the trooper, Lieutenant Jill Frankfurth, that the 70-year-old woman could be trouble.
Grandma has a track record, and it's a very concerning one.
All right, can you come over here for a second? Yeah. Do you have anything on you? Anything sharp? Any weapons or anything?
No.
Okay. You just come over here for me.
Sure.
Hey, do you want to have a seat in my back car?
Well, I don't want to have a seat in your back car.
So this is the deal. I just ran this license plate and something came back, so I got to figure it out. So I'm just going to put you back here until I can figure it out, okay?
Can I shut my...
I will take... We're not going... No, we're not going to go anywhere yet. Let's just stay here, and we're just going to figure out what's going on, and then
Why did they run my license plate?
I ran it when I made a traffic stop, so... Let's just go sit here back here for right now.
Let me
okay?
shut it off.
Nope. I don't want you to go back in the car. Ma'am.
Hanson brazenly defies orders. She is hell-bent on getting back into her car.
No, ma'am.
Why is she trying to get into the car? What is she trying to get to? Is she trying to get back to the car to flee the area?
No, ma'am.
Wait a minute.
You're not allowed to come in here.
Why?
No, stay out of the car. Stay, ma'am. Do not get in that car.
And that's when things turn dangerous.
No! She got a gun!
70-year-old Jean Hanson is pulled over in St. Paul, Minnesota for driving erratically.
I don't want you to go back in the car. Ma'am.
She refuses to follow orders.
Do not get in that car.
And then,
No!
Lieutenant Jill Frankfurth
Don't!
sees something alarming.
No! She got a gun!
This is so dangerous. What if she shot the state trooper?
No! Don't!
From that distance, she could have killed her. No doubt about it.
No! She got a gun! Gun! She got a gun!
She gets behind the vehicle to create that boundary between her and the suspect.
Gun!
As the trooper screams, Hanson takes off.
She just pointed a gun at me.
Copy that. She pointed a gun at you and took off.
Another officer pulls up to see what all the commotion is about.
She pointed a gun at me. I don't know. They're trying to look on camera. She had a warrant.
Then, they go after Hanson.
She's fleeing felon. This is someone who we think is in possession of a gun. They're a danger to not only the officers that are pursuing her, but anyone else who's on that road.
We don't know where she's going next, who she might hurt next, or what is on her mind.
The getaway car is quickly located. And police find Hanson in the most unlikely hiding place.
She's on the outside of this bridge, hanging off with a bottle of tequila in her hand. and it became apparent that she was under some type of mental duress.
In mere minutes, a simple traffic stop has spiraled into a perilous ordeal.
You want to try to help them, but you have to proceed with caution because you don't know if it's a trap. Could they be trying to get you closer just to hurt you before they take out themselves?
This is kind of a perfect storm of disaster. Grandma's not listening to anybody, so they're calling backup.
You're talking the closing of a highway. You're talking SWAT team. You're talking negotiators, mental health professionals.
It takes 2 hours for negotiators to talk Hansen off the bridge. Police place her under arrest. And in court, the judge takes her past into account.
Jean was on a provisional discharge from a mental health facility.
Just 5 months ago, police were called to her house responding to a crisis. And what was Grandma doing? Wielding a shotgun. That time she was charged with second-degree assault and threats of violence.
For the traffic stop incident, Hansen is charged with making threats of violence, fleeing a police officer, and operating a vehicle under the influence. She's ordered to complete a mental health program and is given a stay of adjudication, which puts her on probation instead of behind bars. After her arrest, police learn something shocking about the gun.
She got a gun!
The gun is made of foil and duct tape.
She got a gun! Gun!
In the heat of the moment, you don't stop to think that gun is fake.
The wild story quickly makes headlines and goes viral with more than 500,000 views.
A major takeaway from this video is never judge a book by its cover because looks can be deceiving.
This situation could have ended terribly.
No! She got a gun!
In another frightening viral incident, it's a mail carrier who is caught by surprise.
Take a look at this shocking video.
Terrifying attack. You wouldn't expect a crime like this to happen in a neighborhood like this.
May 13th, 2023, Millburn, New Jersey. A mail carrier is on the second day of a new job.
This looks like a very nice neighborhood, very manicured lawns, very nice houses.
Then, out of nowhere, 2 masked men jump him.
And it's middle of the day, broad daylight. That's probably the most shocking part.
A home security camera records as he screams for help. The men violently knock him right out of his shoes.
It's super aggressive. They tackle him to the ground.
He was actually trying to get the AI in his smartwatch to call 911. I don't think that she understood he was under duress.
When you're trying to alert authorities and your devices are not working, all you can do is fight back. You can kick, you can scratch.
The attackers seem focused on trying to shake something out of his uniform. Then they abruptly flee.
Hey, oh my God! Are you all right?
Lenny Whelan,
Are you all right?
the neighbor whose porch camera records it all, comes out to help. But there's not much he can do.
This crime happened so fast that police wouldn't even have had time to show up.
The mail carrier escapes with only minor injuries and is left in shock.
As a mail carrier, you're really looking out for dogs that are problematic, maybe homes that are hard to find. You're not thinking that someone's going to attack me.
The thieves get away with a skeleton key that opens mailboxes in a nearby apartment complex.
This could have turned out a lot more serious than it did. This man could have been killed.
In New Jersey, it wasn't a dog, but instead 2 masked muggers who chased a mail carrier.
The story tops the local news.
Terrifying attack on a postal worker.
And homeowner Lenny tells reporters he thinks it was calculated.
The first attack happened right here, and then they went around, as you saw from the video. They were watching. They knew exactly what he was doing. Unfortunately, this was only his second day on the job.
The post office offers a reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction.
Video shows the suspects run to a getaway car, possibly a silver Mercedes.
3 weeks later, police identify one of the men, 24-year-old Zachary Little. It turns out he already has a criminal conviction for unlawful possession of a weapon. For the attack on the mail carrier, he's hit with charges of second-degree robbery and conspiracy to commit robbery. As the video goes viral, people question just how smart our smart devices really are. When the world needed Siri the most, she vanished. Listens in the most unneeded places, but fails to identify an emergency.
It's really weird. We get these smart watches because we want it to track our heart rate, make sure we're getting our steps in. But if you notice there's an elevated heart rate, and I'm clearly in a 360 position because I've gotten tossed around and assaulted, you would think, oh, something seems off. Maybe I should, send police.
But mostly, there's sympathy for a guy who was just trying to do his job.
I feel so bad for mail carriers. They're out in all of the elements. They're just trying to get people packages. And to find that someone wants to assault them, it's pretty heartbreaking.
And coming up, a disturbing scene so shocking, you'll need to see the video to believe it's true.
Dude, you cannot put your kid in the damn trunk!
I do want to warn you, the video is hard to watch.
Take the kid out the trunk!
I was just so upset.
Dude, you cannot put your kid in the damn trunk! Okay, listen. No!
Something is really, really wrong.
No, dude!
August 4th, 2021, Pueblo, Colorado. It's a sweltering day, and Sarah Lucero, a busy mother of 5, is working at her beauty salon.
I had been here for a couple hours, and I just went outside to take a little break. I was on the phone, and I heard somebody screaming.
It sounds like a woman in the middle of an argument, so initially, Sarah brushes it off.
I thought she was fighting with her boyfriend, to be honest.
Then, she sees what's really causing the commotion. The woman is inside a car, trying to punch someone.
And I seen a little tiny hand come up and try to block it, and oh my God, it's a child that she's hitting. That's when I kind of lost it.
Sarah records on her phone as the woman gets out and tries to shove the young boy into the trunk.
He was just screaming, and she kind of forced him in there with her hands.
Dude, you can't put that kid in the trunk! Dude, you cannot put your kid in the damn trunk!
Why is the woman doing this?
When it becomes clear that someone is placing a child into a trunk, my initial thought is this a kidnapping?
This is no stranger.
You ain't put a you don't know my trunk. You don't know my child.
It's the child's own mother.
When you realize that this is the child's mother, that takes on a different level of scariness. You don't know what risk you're putting yourself in by getting involved.
Bitch, you cannot have that kid in the trunk.
It was 100 and something degrees. I knew if he had stayed in there, he would have died.
The car has no plates. If this mom takes off, the boy could vanish without a trace. As he wails, Sarah screams with even more urgency.
Take the kid out the trunk.
Finally, the woman relents.
Dude, I was gonna take it. Dude, check this out. No, dude. I swear to God.
When she pulled him out of the trunk, and he just looked like, what is going on? Why are you doing this to me? You could see the fear in his face. You could just feel his anxiety. Every part of him was shaking.
I don't give a what the you ain't getting no drunk.
If this is what's happening in broad daylight in public, What is happening to this child behind closed doors?
You ain't putting that kid in there, I promise you, bitch. Hey, check this out. He's a I don't give a I will tase you in your face.
I wasn't worried about me. I was worried about the child.
You need to back up now. Okay, listen. I don't give a you ain't put a you don't know
You know what? Let him go with you for a week.
Let's see.
Sarah's rant has drawn other witnesses to the scene.
I have 5 kids, babe. I have 5. I have 5 kids and I would never put a kid in no I don't care. It's a baby.
They call 911 and urge her to back off.
Everybody kept just telling me to let them leave. And I'm like, she just put her child in the trunk. If she leaves and this baby dies, we're all at fault.
And this isn't over yet. A man who's been sitting silently in the car the whole time gets out with a gun. Sarah is terrified of what will happen next.
When that man comes into view, now you have 2 people who clearly are perfectly comfortable abusing a child in this way, who are trying to defend themselves.
After a few minutes of tense arguing, he backs off. But to Sarah's horror, the car speeds away before police arrive.
Well, police searching for a woman who reportedly put her 5-year-old child in the trunk of a vehicle. We do want to warn you, the video is hard to watch.
The disturbing video goes viral, and luckily, a woman who knows the mother turns her in. 33-year-old Chelsea Trujillo is quickly arrested and charged with violating bail and criminal trespass. She is sentenced to 3 years behind bars. Her 5-year-old son is taken into protective custody.
I was definitely overwhelmed with the news crews and people just showing up here at my salon, trying to send me gifts and money, and I don't feel like I deserve it. I feel like anybody should have done the same thing.
God bless this bystander, because in most cases, I do not advise people to get involved. Call the police. That's what they're there for. But in this case, when we're talking about a child that is actively being abused and is in imminent danger, this woman did the exact right thing.
I don't give a I will tase you in your face.
1974. A man walked toward what he believed was freedom. He had traveled far to reach this moment. Behind him stood the world he desperately wanted to leave. Ahead of him lay West Berlin, a gateway to possibilities that seemed almost unimaginable for many people living behind the Iron Curtain. For a few brief moments, it appeared that he had succeeded. The crossing point at Friedrichstrasse in East Berlin was one of the most recognizable symbols of the Cold War. Every day, people passed through a maze of checkpoints, documents, inspections, and armed security. It was a place where political systems collided face to face. To one side stood the Communist East. To the other stood the Democratic West. Between them stretched a border that was not simply made of concrete and steel. It was a border built from ideology, fear, surveillance, and power. On that day, a 38-year-old Polish firefighter named Czesław Kukuczka moved through this highly controlled environment, believing that the most difficult part of his journey was finally behind him. He had taken enormous risks to get there. He had challenged authorities. He had gambled everything on a desperate plan. And somehow, against all odds, he appeared to be winning. The officials around him seemed cooperative. Documents had been prepared. Instructions had been given. The path ahead appeared open. Step by step, he moved closer to the western side of the divided city. Perhaps he allowed himself a moment of relief. Perhaps he imagined calling his family one day from a place where he could speak freely. Perhaps he thought about the future he had been chasing for so long. Perhaps he believed that the fear was finally over. No one can know exactly what was passing through his mind during those final moments. What is known is that he was nearing the end of a journey that had been driven by hope, desperation, and the dream of a different life. Then everything changed. Without warning, a shot rang out. There was no final conversation, no last negotiation, no command ordering him to stop, no opportunity to surrender. A plainclothes East German security officer fired from only a few meters away. The bullet struck Kukuczka in the back. He collapsed before reaching the freedom that seemed almost within his grasp. The shooting lasted only a moment. The consequences would echo for decades. At first, the official explanation appeared straightforward. Authorities claimed that a dangerous terrorist had been stopped. Reports were written. Documents were filed. The case was effectively closed. For those in power, the incident was presented as a successful security operation. The man who died was portrayed as a threat. The officer who fired the shot was treated as someone who had done his duty. But history has a way of resurfacing, even when powerful institutions try to bury it. The truth surrounding the death of Czeslaw Kukuczka did not disappear with the paperwork generated. In 1974, it did not vanish behind locked archives. It did not fade away with the passing years. Instead, it remained hidden, waiting. For decades, questions lingered. Why had a Polish firefighter found himself standing at one of the most heavily guarded borders in Europe? Why was he so determined to leave everything behind? Why had East German authorities decided that he could not be allowed to cross? Why was lethal force used against a man who was only steps away from reaching the western side of Berlin? And perhaps most importantly, why would it take more than half a century before a court finally concluded that what happened that day was not an act of self-defense, but a murder? To understand the significance of this case, it is necessary to step back into the world in which it unfolded. The year was 1974. The Cold War divided nations, families, and entire continents. Europe was separated by political boundaries that were often enforced with extraordinary determination. In many parts of the Eastern Bloc, opportunities to leave legally were extremely limited. Travel restrictions were strict. State security services monitored citizens closely. For countless individuals, the dream of starting a new life in the West remained exactly that, a dream. Some accepted their circumstances. Others continued hoping for change. A smaller number chose to risk everything. Czeslaw Kukuczka belonged to that final group. He was not a politician. He was not a military leader. He was not a famous dissident. He was an ordinary man whose story might never have become known outside his family and local community. Yet his death would eventually become one of the most striking examples of the lengths to which Cold War authorities were willing to go in order to prevent an escape. The details that emerged decades later painted a picture very different from the one originally presented to the public. Investigators would eventually discover that the device Kukuczka had used during his confrontation at the Polish embassy was not a real bomb. It could not explode. It posed no genuine threat of detonation. The dramatic image of a heavily armed terrorist, repeated in official narratives, would slowly begin to crumble under scrutiny. Even more disturbing were the revelations concerning what happened after embassy officials contacted East Germany's feared security apparatus. The Ministry for State Security, better known simply as the Stasi. According to documents uncovered years later, authorities did not simply react to events as they unfolded. Instead, they developed a plan. Rather than resolving the situation inside the embassy, they directed Kukuczka toward Friedrichstrasse. They allowed him to believe that his demand had been accepted. They provided him with the impression that he would be permitted to enter West Berlin. He walked toward freedom because he believed freedom had been granted. That belief would cost him his life. The man identified decades later as the shooter was Martin Naumann, a Stasi officer who, according to later court findings, fired the fatal shot that struck Kukuczka from behind. But that conclusion would not come quickly. It would take the collapse of East Germany. It would take the fall of the Berlin Wall. It would take the opening of secret archives. It would take historians, researchers, prosecutors, and judges working through fragments of evidence left behind by a vanished state. And it would take more than 50 years before a Berlin court finally reached a verdict. The extraordinary passage of time is one of the reasons this case remains so compelling. Many murders are investigated immediately. Evidence is collected within hours. Witnesses are questioned within days. Trials occur within months or years. This case followed a different path. The truth spent decades hidden beneath official lies. Witnesses aged. Records disappeared. Entire governments ceased to exist. Yet the questions remained. Who was responsible? What really happened at Friedrichstrasse? Could justice still matter after half a century? The answers would eventually emerge, but only after one of the most remarkable delayed investigations in modern German legal history. At its heart, however, this story is not primarily about governments, intelligence agencies, courtrooms, or politics. It is about a man, a husband, a father, a firefighter, a person who believed a different future might be possible. A person who walked toward a border carrying hopes that countless others living under communist rule also carried. A person who never reached the other side. This is the story of Czesław Kukuczka. It is a story of desperation, deception, state power, and delayed justice. It begins at a border crossing in divided Berlin, where freedom appeared to be only a few steps away, and where a single gunshot changed everything. Long before a gunshot echoed through the Friedrichstrasse border crossing, before secret police reports were written, before investigators began uncovering hidden truths decades later, there was simply a man named Czesław Kukuczka. When discussing cases connected to the Cold War, it is often easy to become consumed by the larger forces at work. Governments, intelligence agencies, military alliances, ideological conflicts, and political systems tend to dominate the narrative. Yet every historical event ultimately affects individual lives. Behind every official document stands a human being. Behind every statistic is a family. Behind every tragedy is a person whose future was permanently altered. In this case, that person was Czesław Kukuczka. According to the available records, Kukuczka was born in Poland in 1936. He belonged to a generation whose entire life was shaped by some of the most turbulent events of the 20th century. His childhood unfolded in the aftermath of the Second World War, a conflict that devastated Poland and left lasting scars across Europe. As he grew older, the political landscape around him transformed dramatically. Poland became part of the Soviet sphere of influence, and the communist system established itself as the dominant force in everyday life. By adulthood, Kukuczka had built what appeared to be an ordinary life. He worked as a firefighter, a profession associated with public service, responsibility, and courage. Firefighters are often remembered for the moments when they run toward danger while others flee. Their work is practical, demanding, and often physically exhausting. It is not a profession typically associated with political intrigue or international incidents. Yet history has a way of placing ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Kukuczka was also a husband and a father. Beyond those basic facts, many personal details of his daily life remain unknown. The historical record does not provide extensive accounts of his private routines, his hobbies, his conversations around the dinner table, or the countless ordinary moments that make up a human life. What survives instead are fragments, pieces of information that help explain why he eventually made a decision that would place him on a collision course with one of the most powerful security systems. In Eastern Europe, the surviving records suggest that Kukuczka had become increasingly dissatisfied with life under communist rule. Economic difficulties formed part of that reality. Like many citizens living behind the Iron Curtain, he faced limitations that people in Western countries often took for granted. Opportunities were restricted, travel was controlled, individual freedom existed within boundaries established by the state. For many people, these conditions were frustrating but unavoidable. They adapted to the system because there seemed to be no realistic alternative. Others dreamed of leaving. Throughout the Cold War, the idea of escape occupied a powerful place in the imagination of countless citizens living in Eastern Bloc countries. Stories circulated about people who had successfully crossed borders. Rumors spread about better opportunities in the West. Families discussed relatives who had emigrated years earlier. Letters arrived from abroad describing different lives and different possibilities. For some, those stories represented hope. For others, they represented temptation. For authorities, they represented a threat. Kukuczka reportedly hoped not only to leave communist Eastern Europe, but eventually to settle in the United States, where relatives were already living. That detail is important because it suggests his aspirations extended beyond merely crossing a border. He was not simply seeking a short-term escape. He envisioned an entirely different future. Such dreams were difficult to pursue legally. To understand why, it is necessary to understand the political world of the 1970s. The Cold War was not merely a conflict between governments. It was a global struggle between competing political and economic systems. On one side stood the Soviet Union and its allies. On the other stood Western democracies led by the United States and its partners. Europe became the central stage upon which this rivalry played out. The continent was divided both physically and ideologically. The phrase Iron Curtain was often used to describe this separation. It referred not only to actual borders, but also to the barriers restricting movement, information, and personal freedom. Crossing from east to west was not a simple matter. For citizens of many Eastern Bloc countries, obtaining permission to emigrate could be extremely difficult. Authorities feared losing workers, professionals, and skilled citizens. They also feared the political message that departures might send. Every successful escape could be interpreted as a public rejection of the communist system. As a result, governments invested enormous resources into preventing people from leaving. Among all the locations symbolizing this division, none carried greater significance than Berlin. Following the Second World War, Berlin became one of the most unusual cities on Earth. Although located deep inside East Germany, the city itself was divided into eastern and western sectors. Over time, Berlin evolved into a visible representation of the Cold War itself. East Berlin served as the capital of East Germany. West Berlin existed as a western enclave surrounded by communist territory. The contrast between the two sides of the city became one of the defining images of the era. By the time Kukuczka arrived in Berlin, the city had already spent years living under the shadow of division. The Berlin Wall had become one of the most recognizable structures in the world. Armed guards, checkpoints, surveillance systems, and border controls formed part of daily life. For East German authorities, maintaining the integrity of the border was a matter of national policy. For many individuals, however, the border represented something else entirely. It represented possibility. A successful crossing could mean access to opportunities unavailable in the East. It could mean reunification with relatives. It could mean political freedom. It could mean the chance to build a new life. The difficulty of achieving such a crossing only increased its symbolic power. Among the various crossing points connecting East and West Berlin, Friedrichstrasse occupied a special place. It was one of the best-known border checkpoints in the divided city. Travelers passed through layers of security procedures designed to ensure that movement remained under strict control. To many people, Friedrichstrasse represented a threshold between two worlds. One side embodied state control and surveillance. The other represented the promise, whether real or imagined, of greater freedom. At some point before March 1974, Kukuczka came to view Berlin as a potential gateway to that future. The records do not provide a complete account of every step that brought him there. They do not preserve every conversation or every private struggle. What they reveal is the outcome of a process that had likely been developing for a long time. People rarely abandon their lives overnight. Such decisions usually emerge from accumulated frustrations, disappointments, hopes, and fears. They are often the result of months or years of internal debate. Should I stay? Should I leave? Can I build a future here? Will conditions improve? What risks am I willing to take? What will happen to my family? What happens if I fail? These questions have confronted countless individuals throughout history. For people living under restrictive political systems, they often carried particularly heavy consequences. Whatever thoughts occupied Kukuczka's mind during those years, one conclusion appears clear from the historical record, remaining where he was no longer seemed acceptable to him. He wanted another path. He wanted another future. And he was willing to take extraordinary risks to pursue it. That willingness would ultimately bring him to East Berlin. It would bring him to the Polish embassy. It would bring him into contact with the Stasi. And it would place him at the center of an event that neither he nor anyone around him could fully foresee. By the spring of 1974, the pressures that had been building in his life appeared to reach a breaking point. The ordinary firefighter from Poland was about to make a desperate move. A move that would attract the attention of one of the most feared security organizations in Europe. A move that would transform him from an unknown citizen into the subject of secret reports, political calculations, and eventually a murder investigation spanning more than 50 years. The stage was set. The Cold War was at its height. Berlin remained divided. The border remained heavily guarded. And on the morning of March 29, 1974, Czesław Kukuczka would walk into the Polish embassy carrying a device that appeared to be a bomb and a demand that would set the rest of this story into motion. By the morning of March 29, 1974, whatever internal struggle had occupied Czesław Kukuczka for months or perhaps years had reached its conclusion. The ordinary options available to him no longer seemed sufficient. The dream of leaving the Eastern Bloc, of escaping the limitations he experienced under communist rule, had become something he was prepared to pursue through extraordinary means. That decision would set in motion a chain of events that, decades later, would be examined by historians, prosecutors, judges, and journalists. But on that morning, none of those future investigations existed. There was only a man carrying a desperate plan into the Polish embassy in East Berlin. The embassy was not merely a diplomatic building. In the Cold War world, embassies represented extensions of state authority. They were places where political interests, security concerns, and international relationships intersected. For Kukuczka, however, the embassy represented something more immediate, a possible path out. According to the historical record, Kukuczka entered the Polish embassy and presented what appeared to be an explosive device. He then made a demand. He wanted permission to travel to West Berlin. The moment must have immediately transformed the atmosphere inside the building. Embassy personnel suddenly found themselves facing a man who claimed to possess a bomb. Regardless of whether the device was real, those present had no way of knowing that at the time. They were forced to respond to the threat as if it were genuine. What is crucial, however, is what later investigations would reveal. The device was not an actual bomb. It contained no real explosives. It could not detonate. It posed no genuine capability of causing the destruction that authorities initially feared. This distinction would become enormously important decades later because it fundamentally altered the interpretation of the entire event. The official narrative promoted after the shooting would portray Kukuczka as a dangerous terrorist. Yet the evidence eventually showed that the object he carried was merely a mock explosive device. The threat that appeared so alarming on March 29, 1974, was not what it seemed. Just as important is what did not happen inside the embassy. No one was killed. No one was physically injured. No hostages were taken. No explosion occurred. The confrontation remained limited to Kukuczka's demand and the authorities' response. Many years later, researchers examining the case would characterize the incident not as a genuine terrorist operation, but as a desperate act by a man attempting to force an escape route that otherwise seemed unavailable. Whether embassy personnel interpreted the situation that way at the time is another question. Entirely. Faced with uncertainty and potential danger, they acted according to the protocols available to them. They contacted East German authorities. That decision changed everything. Once the East German security apparatus became involved, the situation ceased to be solely a diplomatic matter. It entered the domain of one of the most feared organizations in the communist world, the Ministry for State Security, better known as the Stasi. To understand what happened next, it is important to understand how East German authorities viewed escape attempts. Throughout the Cold War, East Germany invested enormous resources into preventing people from fleeing to the West. Border security was treated as a matter of national importance. Successful escapes were viewed not merely as individual decisions, but as political embarrassments. Every person who crossed into the West represented a challenge to the state's legitimacy. The Stasi existed to identify, monitor, and neutralize perceived threats to the regime. When information reached them about a Polish citizen attempting to force his way into West Berlin through a dramatic confrontation at an embassy, their interest was immediate. Documents uncovered decades later suggest that East German authorities quickly reached a conclusion. Czeslaw Kukuczka must not be allowed to reach West Berlin. That objective appears to have guided everything that followed. At this point in the story, an observer might reasonably expect a different outcome. One possibility would have been an arrest inside the embassy. Another possibility would have involved formal criminal proceedings. Authorities could have detained Kukuczka and investigated the incident through legal channels. Such outcomes might seem logical given the circumstances. But that is not what happened. Instead, East German authorities developed another approach. According to records later recovered from Stasi archives, officials decided to remove the immediate tension from the embassy environment. Rather than confront Kukuczka there, they devised a plan that would move him elsewhere. Specifically, they directed attention toward Friedrichstrasse. The checkpoint at Friedrichstrasse occupied a unique place within divided Berlin. It functioned as one of the primary crossing points between East and West. Every day, travelers moved through its corridors, checkpoints, and inspection stations. Security personnel monitored movement carefully. Documents were checked. Procedures were enforced. The entire environment reflected the tension of a city divided by ideology and guarded by force. It was also the location where authorities intended to bring Kukuczka. The next stage of the operation depended upon one essential element: deception. Officials informed Kukuczka that his demand had effectively been accepted. He was led to believe that arrangements had been made. Necessary documentation was supposedly available. The process of allowing him to travel onward appeared to be underway. For a man who had risked everything to obtain precisely that outcome, the development must have seemed extraordinary. After all, his objective from the beginning had been straightforward. He wanted passage to West Berlin. Now, according to the people around him, that possibility appeared real. There is no surviving record that fully captures his private thoughts during those moments. Yet it is difficult not to recognize the significance of the situation. For perhaps the first time since entering the embassy, the future he had envisioned no longer seemed impossible. The confrontation appeared to be ending. The danger appeared to be passing. The authorities appeared willing to cooperate. Most importantly, the path toward freedom appeared open. At some point during this process, Kukuczka surrendered the fake bomb. This detail would later become particularly significant because it demonstrated that the object authorities claimed justified extreme measures was no longer in his possession. The situation had fundamentally changed. Yet the operation continued. Escorted by officials, Kukuczka proceeded toward Friedrichstrasse. The checkpoint represented the final stage of what he believed was a successful effort. Every step brought him closer to the western side of Berlin. Every completed procedure reinforced the impression that his plan had worked. Meanwhile, events were unfolding around him that he could not see. According to later investigations, multiple Stasi officers had already been positioned near the crossing. Among them was Martin Naumann. Unlike Kukuczka, Naumann knew the true purpose of the operation. The records that emerged decades later indicate that Naumann had been assigned a specific responsibility. His role was not to assist Kukuczka in reaching the West. His role was to ensure that Kukuczka did not reach it. The contrast between the two men at that moment is striking. One believed he was approaching freedom. The other had been deployed to prevent it. One was looking ahead. The other was watching him. One thought the crisis was ending. The other was preparing for its final act. As Kukuczka moved through Friedrichstrasse, he reportedly passed much of the checkpoint process. West Berlin was no longer an abstract destination. It was physically close. The distance separating him from the world he wanted to enter had narrowed dramatically. Few moments in Cold War history capture the emotional weight of division more powerfully than this. 1. After years of frustration, after leaving Poland, after confronting embassy officials, after presenting a fake bomb, after believing his demand had succeeded, Kukuczka was now within reach of the goal that had motivated everything. Then came the final moments. According to the evidence later accepted by the court, there was no warning. No command ordering him a halt. No attempt at renewed negotiation. No opportunity for surrender. No indication that deadly force was about to be used. Martin Naumann approached from behind. The distance between the two men was reportedly only a few meters. Then Naumann fired. The bullet struck Kukuczka in the back. In an instant, the future he had been pursuing disappeared. The shooting transformed the atmosphere at Friedrichstrasse immediately. Moments earlier, the crossing had represented possibility. Now it had become the scene of a fatal operation. Kukuczka collapsed, severely wounded. Yet the shot did not kill him immediately. Witness accounts later indicated that he remained alive after being hit, gravely injured and suffering severe blood loss. He lay wounded as authorities responded to the aftermath of the shooting. Medical assistance followed. He was transported for treatment. But the injury proved catastrophic. Despite efforts to save him, Kukuczka died from the gunshot wound. The significance of that fact cannot be separated from the location where it occurred. He was not killed hundreds of miles from his destination. He was not stopped at the beginning of his journey. He was not intercepted before reaching Berlin. He died at the threshold. The freedom he had sought was physically close enough to imagine. Yet he never reached it. For East German authorities, however, the operation was not yet complete. A second phase was already beginning. The shooting itself had lasted only seconds. The explanation that followed would endure for decades. Officials quickly constructed a narrative portraying Kukuczka as a dangerous armed terrorist. The use of deadly force would be presented as necessary. Reports would be written. Justifications would be documented. A story would emerge that differed dramatically from the reality later uncovered by investigators. The man who died would be described as a threat. The officer who fired would be portrayed as acting appropriately. And for many years, the truth about what happened at Friedrichstrasse on March 29, 1974, would remain buried inside the secret archives of a state determined to protect its own version of events. But history was not finished with the case. The gunshot had ended Czeslaw Kukuczka's life. It had not ended the story. When Czeslaw Kukuczka died from the gunshot wound he received at Friedrichstrasse on March 29, 1974, the official version of events was established with remarkable speed. In authoritarian systems, control over information is often almost as important as control over people. What happened after the shooting would demonstrate precisely how powerful institutions can shape public understanding of an event, particularly when those institutions control the flow of evidence, the wording of reports, and the official record itself. For East German authorities, the immediate challenge was not simply explaining why a man had been shot at a border crossing. The challenge was ensuring that the explanation protected the legitimacy of the state and the actions of its security services. The narrative that emerged was clear and deliberate. According to official accounts, Kukuczka was presented as a dangerous terrorist. Authorities portrayed him as a serious threat. The shooting was described as a necessary response. The officer who fired the fatal shot was depicted as someone acting appropriately under difficult circumstances. Within this version of events, the death at Friedrichstrasse was not a tragedy. It was a success. Security personnel had supposedly neutralized a dangerous individual and protected public safety. For years, that explanation remained largely unchallenged. The public did not have access to internal Stasi files. Independent investigators could not examine the evidence. Journalists could not freely scrutinize the operation. The people responsible for constructing the narrative controlled the records that supported it. As a result, the official story became the dominant story. But beneath that carefully managed version of events, another reality existed. That reality remained hidden inside archives, classified reports, and secret documentation generated by the East German security apparatus. At the time, almost nobody outside those institutions could see it. One of the most revealing aspects of the case would only emerge decades later: the extent to which authorities actively shaped the narrative after the shooting. Documents uncovered following the collapse of East Germany indicated that reports had been altered and adjusted in ways that justified the use of lethal force. Information was organized to support the official explanation. The image of Kukuczka as a dangerous terrorist became a central element of the state's account. This was particularly significant because later evidence demonstrated that several key assumptions behind that narrative were deeply misleading. The device Kukuczka had carried into the Polish embassy was not a functioning bomb. He had not possessed a genuine explosive capability. He had surrendered the device before reaching Friedrichstrasse. No evidence showed him attacking anyone at the checkpoint. Yet the official story emphasized danger while minimizing or obscuring facts that complicated the justification for the shooting. The effort to protect the state's version of events did not stop with paperwork. According to records later uncovered, some participants in the operation received recognition for their actions. Rather than facing scrutiny, individuals involved were praised. The operation itself was presented as an example of successful security work. Awards and commendations reinforced the official interpretation that a threat had been eliminated, rather than a man deceived and killed. For those inside the system, the case appeared resolved. But outside the system, another group of people was left to confront a very different reality. Back in Poland, Kukuczka's family received news that would alter their lives forever. A husband was gone. A father was gone. Yet the information provided to those closest to him was limited. The full circumstances surrounding his death were not explained. The family was not given access to the complete truth. They did not receive a transparent account of what had occurred at Friedrichstrasse. Instead, like so many families living under authoritarian governments during the Cold War, they encountered silence. Questions remained unanswered. How had he died? Why had he died? What exactly had happened in East Berlin? The available records suggest that those answers were not provided. Weeks later, Kukuczka's widow received his cremated remains along with official documentation confirming his death. For the family, the loss was immediate. The truth was not. Years passed. Then more years passed. The Cold War continued. Governments changed leaders. International crises came and went. Yet the reality of what had happened at Friedrichstrasse remained concealed. The secrecy surrounding the case was aided by the extraordinary power of the institution involved. The Stasi was not an ordinary law enforcement agency. It was one of the most extensive and feared security organizations in modern history. Its surveillance network penetrated nearly every aspect of East German society. Informants were everywhere. Files were kept on countless individuals. Information was collected on a massive scale. Ironically, the same system that helped conceal the truth would eventually help reveal it. Because the Stasi documented so much of what it did, it unknowingly created a historical record capable of exposing its own actions decades later. But first, history itself would have to change. The turning point arrived in 1989. Across Eastern Europe, communist governments faced growing pressure. Political movements gained momentum. Public protests increased. Long-standing systems that had once appeared permanent suddenly looked vulnerable. Then came one of the defining moments of the 20th century. The Berlin Wall fell. For decades, the wall had symbolized division, repression, and the physical separation of East and West. Its collapse represented something much larger than the opening of a border. It signaled the beginning of the end for the East German state itself. The following year, East Germany ceased to exist. The government that had overseen the shooting of Czesław Kukuczka disappeared. The institutions that had controlled information lost their monopoly over the truth. And perhaps most importantly, access to the archives began to expand. Millions of pages of Stasi records became available to researchers, historians, journalists, and investigators. The process was enormous. The archives contained vast quantities of material accumulated over decades. Within those files were records documenting surveillance operations, internal communications, investigations, and political activities. Among them were documents connected to Kukuczka's death. What followed was not a single dramatic revelation, but a gradual reconstruction of events. Researchers began comparing official accounts against surviving records. Historians examined internal documents. Investigators analyzed inconsistencies. Piece by piece, the official narrative began to unravel. One of the most important discoveries involved the so-called bomb. The image of Kukuczka as a heavily armed terrorist depended heavily upon the assumption that he possessed a genuine explosive device. The evidence showed otherwise. The object was fake. It was incapable of carrying out the destruction implied by official accounts. This finding fundamentally changed how the entire incident was understood. Additional discoveries raised further questions. If Kukuczka did not possess a real bomb, why had authorities continued describing him as a dangerous terrorist? If he had surrendered the device, what immediate threat existed at Friedrichstrasse? If he was approaching West Berlin under the belief that permission had been granted, why was deadly force used? As more documents surfaced, investigators encountered evidence suggesting that the shooting was not a spontaneous reaction. Instead, it appeared to be the result of prior planning. The operation at Friedrichstrasse increasingly looked less like an emergency response and more like a coordinated effort designed to prevent Kukuczka from reaching the West. The deception became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. According to the records eventually examined by investigators, Kukuczka had been led to believe that his request had succeeded. He had been encouraged to proceed toward the border. He had been given the impression that passage was possible. Yet at the same time, security personnel were positioning themselves to stop him. This contradiction transformed the understanding of the case. Rather than confronting a dangerous attacker, authorities appear to have created circumstances that placed Kukuczka exactly where they wanted him before using lethal force. As investigators continued examining the surviving evidence, attention increasingly focused on a specific individual, Martin Naumann. The records pointed toward Naumann as the officer who fired the fatal shot. Establishing that fact was not simple. Half a century had passed. Memories faded. Witnesses aged. Some potential witnesses had died. Documents had been lost or destroyed. The passage of time created obstacles that would challenge any investigation. In fact, one of the most remarkable aspects of the case is that it was investigated at all. Many crimes committed under authoritarian regimes become effectively impossible to prosecute decades later. Evidence disappears. Records vanish. Responsible individuals cannot be identified with certainty. Yet despite those challenges, investigators continued piecing together the events of March 29, 1974. The process resembled assembling a puzzle with many missing pieces. A report recovered from one archive would be compared against another document found elsewhere. Historical research would be combined with legal analysis. Fragments of evidence would be evaluated collectively rather than individually. Gradually, a clearer picture emerged. The shooting had not occurred in the manner originally described. The official narrative contained serious distortions. The claim of necessary self-defense became increasingly difficult to sustain. Most importantly, evidence connected Martin Naumann directly to the fatal shot. By this stage, the case had evolved far beyond a historical inquiry. It was becoming a criminal investigation. The question was no longer simply what happened. The question was whether accountability remained possible. Could a man be prosecuted for a killing committed more than 50 years earlier? Could evidence gathered from Cold War archives support a modern criminal case? Could justice still function after so much time had passed? For investigators, these questions became central. The answers would ultimately be determined in court. But before any verdict could be delivered, prosecutors first had to decide whether the surviving evidence justified bringing formal charges. After decades of silence, concealment, and uncertainty, the case was moving toward its most significant turning point since the day of the shooting itself. The hidden files had begun to speak. The official narrative was collapsing. And for the first time since March 29, 1974, the possibility emerged that someone might finally be held responsible for the death of Czesław Kukuczka. By the time the case of Czesław Kukuczka finally reached a courtroom, the world in which the crime had occurred no longer existed. The German Democratic Republic had vanished decades earlier. The Berlin Wall had long since fallen. The Cold War had become history. Entire generations had grown up without first-hand memories of the divided Europe that had shaped the events of March 29, 1974. Even many of the people connected to the case were no longer alive. Yet despite the enormous passage of time, one question remained unresolved. Who should be held responsible for the death of Czeslaw Kukuczka? For years, that question had existed primarily in the realm of historical research. Historians sought to reconstruct events. Journalists examined archival documents. Scholars studied the practices of East German state security agencies. The case was important because it revealed how the machinery of the Cold War operated. Eventually, however, the issue became larger than history. It became a matter of criminal responsibility. The archival discoveries made after the collapse of East Germany had transformed the understanding of the shooting. Evidence recovered from Stasi records suggested that the official narrative created in 1974 was deeply misleading. The image of Kukuczka as a dangerous terrorist acting in a manner that justified lethal force no longer aligned with the facts uncovered by investigators. Instead, a different picture had emerged. A Polish firefighter carrying a fake bomb. A desperate attempt to obtain passage to West Berlin. A carefully managed operation by East German authorities. A deception that convinced the victim he would be allowed to cross. A shot fired from behind. A death that occurred only moments before freedom appeared within reach. These conclusions did not merely challenge the historical record. They created the foundation for legal action. German prosecutors ultimately concluded that sufficient evidence existed to pursue the case. That decision alone was remarkable. Criminal prosecutions become increasingly difficult as time passes. Witnesses disappear. Memories fade. Physical evidence is lost. The legal system generally functions best when investigations begin immediately after a crime occurs. Here, prosecutors faced a delay measured not in months or years, but in decades. More than half a century had passed. Yet prosecutors believed the evidence remained strong enough to move forward. At the center of the case stood Martin Naumann. According to the evidence recovered from archival records, Naumann was identified as the Stasi officer who fired the fatal shot at Friedrichstrasse. By the time legal proceedings moved forward, Naumann was no longer the young security officer who had participated in the operation in 1974. He was an elderly man. The decades separating the crime from the trial created an unusual atmosphere around the proceedings. The court was not simply examining an individual act of violence. It was also confronting a historical legacy that stretched back into one of the most politically charged periods of modern European history. Cases involving former members of authoritarian security services often raised difficult questions. To what extent is an individual responsible for actions carried out within a larger political system? Can following orders excuse participation in unlawful killings? How should courts evaluate crimes committed under governments that no longer exist? What obligations remain when decades have passed? These broader issues formed part of the context surrounding the trial, even though the court's central responsibility remained focused on a much narrower question. What happened on March 29, 1974? And did that conduct constitute murder? Prosecutors argued that it did. Their case rested on several key points. First, they challenged the long-standing claim that the shooting was an act of self-defense. The evidence suggested that Kukuczka did not present an immediate lethal threat at the moment he was shot. Investigators had already established that the device he carried into the embassy was not a real bomb. The records indicated that he had surrendered the device before arriving at Friedrichstrasse. The official portrayal of an armed terrorist actively threatening security personnel became increasingly difficult to support. Second, prosecutors argued that the operation itself had been planned, rather than responding spontaneously to an unfolding emergency. Authorities had allegedly created circumstances designed to bring Kukuczka to a specific location. The deception used against him became particularly significant. He had been led to believe that his request to enter West Berlin had been approved. He had proceeded toward the border under that assumption. At the same time, security personnel had been positioned nearby. According to the prosecution's interpretation, this sequence of events demonstrated deliberate intent rather than a split-second reaction to danger. Third, prosecutors focused on the manner of the shooting itself. The evidence indicated that Kukuczka was shot from behind. Equally important, investigators found no indication that he had been given a warning immediately before the fatal shot. The absence of a warning became a critical factor in evaluating the justification for lethal force. Together, these elements formed the foundation of the prosecution's argument. The shooting was intentional. The victim posed no immediate threat requiring deadly force. The operation had been planned. The official explanation provided in 1974 was false. For the court, the challenge lay in evaluating evidence that originated from a distant historical period. Archival documents became crucial. Records preserved by the Stasi decades earlier were examined in a legal setting very different from the political environment in which they had originally been created. The irony was difficult to ignore. The same bureaucracy that had attempted to conceal the truth had also documented enough of its own activities to help expose it. Every recovered file became part of a larger effort to reconstruct the events of a single day. Every surviving document represented a fragment of evidence bridging the gap between 1974 and the present. As the proceedings unfolded, the court examined the historical record carefully. The judges were tasked not with evaluating the Cold War itself, but with determining whether a specific criminal act had occurred. The distinction mattered. The trial was not a referendum on East Germany. It was not a judgment of an entire political system. It was a legal examination of one killing. Yet separating the individual act from the broader historical context was not always easy. The shooting had occurred precisely because of the political realities of the Cold War. The border existed because of those realities. The Stasi existed because of those realities. The effort to prevent escapes reflected policies deeply embedded within the East German state. Even so, the court ultimately focused on the evidence connected directly to Kukuczka's death. The key issue remained whether the shooting could legally be justified. After examining the evidence, the court reached its conclusion. The judges rejected the claim that the shooting constituted self-defense. The evidence did not support the narrative that had been promoted for decades. Instead, the court determined that Kukuczka had been unlawfully killed. The decision represented a dramatic reversal of the official version established in 1974. For more than 50 years, the state narrative had portrayed the incident as a legitimate security action. Now a court concluded that the killing was criminal. The significance of that finding extended beyond the individual case. It demonstrated that historical narratives created by powerful institutions could be challenged. It demonstrated that archival evidence could expose long-concealed wrongdoing. And it demonstrated that the passage of time did not automatically erase responsibility. In 2024, the Berlin court convicted Martin Naumann of murder. The sentence imposed was 10 years in prison. The verdict marked one of the most important moments in the history of the case. For the first time since the shooting, legal accountability had been established. The outcome was also historically significant for another reason. Relatively few former Stasi officers have been convicted of murder for actions connected to East Germany's border policies. The complexity of proving responsibility decades later makes such cases exceptionally difficult. Many investigations never progress to conviction. This case did. As a result, the judgment carried symbolic weight far beyond the courtroom itself. For historians, it represented official recognition of what archival research had gradually revealed. For prosecutors, It represented the successful resolution of a case that many might have considered impossible to pursue. For observers of Cold War history, it became another example of how long-hidden actions can eventually come under judicial scrutiny. And for the memory of Czeslaw Kukuczka, it marked the first time a court formally acknowledged that the official explanation surrounding his death was not the truth. The verdict did not change what happened at Friedrichstrasse. It did not return a husband to his family. It did not erase 50 years of uncertainty. It could not undo the deception that led Kukuczka to believe he was finally reaching freedom. What it could do was establish a factual and legal record. A man had been shot in the back. The shooting was not justified. The person responsible had been identified. And after more than half a century, a court had finally delivered its judgment. For many criminal cases, a verdict represents the end of the story. For this one, it represented something slightly different. It was the closing chapter of a legal battle. But it was also the beginning of a broader conversation about memory, accountability, and the enduring consequences of life behind the Iron Curtain. Those consequences extended far beyond the courtroom, and they would continue shaping how the world remembered Czeslaw Kukuczka long after the trial had ended. When people think about true crime stories, they often focus on the moment a crime occurs. The attack, the victim, the investigation. The courtroom verdict. These are usually the events that receive the most attention. Yet some cases leave behind consequences that extend far beyond the crime itself. They become part of a larger story about society, history, and the ways in which truth can survive even the most determined attempts to suppress it. The death of Czeslaw Kukuczka is one of those cases. At first glance, it may appear to be the story of a single man killed at a border crossing during the Cold War. But when viewed through a wider lens, it becomes something much larger. It becomes a story about power and vulnerability, about the relationship between governments and ordinary citizens, about the human cost of political division, and perhaps most importantly, about the extraordinary persistence of truth. When Kukuczka died on March 29, 1974, East German authorities likely believed the case was finished. The operation had been carried out. The official reports had been written. The public narrative had been established. The victim was dead. The witnesses possessed limited information. The institutions responsible for the shooting controlled the records. From the perspective of the state, there was little reason to believe the story would ever be seriously challenged. History, however, often moves in unexpected directions. The officials who approved reports in 1974 could not know that the East German state itself would disappear. They could not know that the Berlin Wall would fall. They could not know that archives would eventually be opened to public examination. They could not know that historians and prosecutors decades later would reconstruct events they believed had been successfully hidden. For many years, however, none of that had happened yet. The immediate aftermath belonged not to historians or investigators, but to Kukuczka's family. The available records reveal only limited details about their experience. But even those fragments carry enormous emotional weight. A wife lost her husband. Children lost their father. A family lost someone they loved. And they were forced to confront that loss without understanding the full truth. One of the most painful aspects of the case is the length of time that uncertainty endured. Many families affected by violent crime eventually receive answers. Investigations may be difficult, but facts emerge. Witnesses testify. Court proceedings establish a public record. Even when justice feels incomplete, there is often at least some understanding of what happened. For Kukuczka's family, that process did not occur. Instead, they received only partial information. Weeks after his death, his widow received his ashes and official documentation. But the real story remained hidden. For decades, The circumstances surrounding his death existed behind walls of secrecy built by a government determined to control the narrative. The silence itself became part of the tragedy. Questions remained unanswered. What exactly happened at Friedrichstrasse? Why had he been shot? What had occurred during his final hours? Who was responsible? These are questions that lingered for years, then decades. The eventual discovery of the truth, therefore, carried significance beyond the legal outcome. It represented the restoration of a historical reality that had been denied for generations. The importance of that restoration should not be underestimated. Authoritarian systems often rely upon the ability to shape public memory. If an event can be controlled, documented selectively, and explained through official channels, then future generations may inherit a distorted version of history. The Kukuczka case demonstrates both the power and the limitations of that approach. For a long time, the official version prevailed, but not forever. Eventually, evidence emerged. Documents survived. Archives opened. Researchers began asking questions. The truth resurfaced. In that sense, the story serves as a reminder that historical accountability can operate on a very different timetable than political power. Governments may control information for years, sometimes for decades. Yet the passage of time does not guarantee permanent secrecy. The larger historical significance of the case extends beyond the fate of one individual. Today, the shooting of Czesław Kukuczka is often discussed as a symbol of East Germany's broader approach toward those who attempted to escape. The Cold War produced countless stories involving borders, checkpoints, and divided families. Across Europe, individuals sought opportunities to leave systems they found restrictive. Some succeeded, others were captured, some paid with their lives. Kukuczka's case occupies a distinctive place within that history because of the circumstances surrounding his death. He was not attempting a secret nighttime crossing through a remote section of border defenses. He was not engaged in a violent confrontation at the moment he was shot. Instead, according to the findings that emerged decades later, he was moving toward West Berlin under the belief that authorities had agreed to let him pass. That detail continues to resonate because it highlights the role deception played in the operation. The image is difficult to forget. A man believes he is finally reaching freedom. He has been told his request has been accepted. He proceeds toward the border. Then he is shot from behind. Even decades later, the starkness of those facts remains striking. The story also forces modern audiences to confront an uncomfortable question about the meaning of borders during the Cold War. Today, many people cross international boundaries routinely. Travel remains subject to regulations. But in much of Europe, movement has become dramatically easier than it was in 1974. The world Kukuczka inhabited was different. For millions of people living behind the Iron Curtain, a border was not merely a geographic line. It could determine where a person lived, where they worked, what information they could access, what opportunities they could pursue, whom they could visit, and in some cases, whether they could leave at all. Understanding that reality helps explain why individuals sometimes took extraordinary risks. Kukuczka's decision to enter the Polish embassy carrying a fake bomb was unquestionably desperate. Yet desperation itself tells a story. People rarely gamble everything unless they believe ordinary options have disappeared. The case therefore reveals not only the actions of a security service, but also the pressures experienced by individuals trapped within restrictive systems. Another reason the case remains important lies in the extraordinary delay between the crime and the conviction. More than 50 years passed before a court formally determined that Kukuczka had been murdered. 50 years is longer than many careers, longer than many marriages, longer than entire political eras. The sheer length of time raises difficult questions about justice. Can justice still matter after half a century? Does accountability lose meaning when it arrives so late? Different people may answer those questions differently. Some might argue that no verdict could truly compensate for decades of concealment. Others might point out that a delayed acknowledgement of truth is still preferable to permanent silence. The court's decision in 2024 cannot change the events of 1974. It cannot restore the life that was taken. It cannot erase the suffering experienced by Kukuczka's family. What it can do is establish an official recognition of what happened. And sometimes that recognition matters. History is filled with cases in which crimes remained hidden indefinitely. The Kukuczka case ultimately followed a different path. The truth emerged. Responsibility was assigned. The record was corrected. For historians, that outcome represents an important victory for evidence and documentation. For legal scholars, it demonstrates that even decades-old crimes can remain subject to scrutiny. For society more broadly, it serves as a reminder that institutions should never be immune from examination. But perhaps the most meaningful perspective is the simplest one. Beyond all the politics, investigations, and court proceedings, the story remains centered on a single individual. A firefighter, a husband, a father, a man who hoped for a different future. When discussing Cold War history, it is easy to become overwhelmed by statistics and political narratives. Thousands of pages have been written about governments, intelligence agencies, treaties, and ideological conflicts. Yet history is ultimately experienced one life at a time. Czesław Kukuczka was not attempting to reshape global politics. He was trying to reshape his own future. That future ended at Friedrichstrasse. Yet the memory of what happened there endured. Today, the border crossing where he was shot no longer serves the purpose it once did. The Berlin Wall is gone. East Germany is gone. The Cold War itself belongs to history. What remains are the lessons. The lesson that secrecy can delay the truth, but may not destroy it. The lesson that official narratives deserve scrutiny. The lesson that ordinary people often bear the greatest burden when political systems place power above individual lives. And perhaps the lesson that justice, while imperfect and often delayed, can still matter. As we return one final time to that morning in March 1974, the image remains hauntingly simple. A man walks toward West Berlin. He believes he has succeeded. The distance separating him from freedom is measured not in miles but in mere steps. Then a shot is fired. He falls before reaching the other side. For decades, the truth falls with him. Hidden, buried, protected by official lies and locked archives. But unlike the man whose life ended that day, the truth continues its journey. It survives governments. It survives political systems. It survives the passage of time. And more than 50 years later, it finally reaches the destination that Czesław Kukuczka never could. The border remained closed to him. History did not. And that is why his story is still remembered today. There is a tendency to imagine history as something settled. Once an event passes into the past, it can feel fixed, complete, and beyond change. Dates are recorded. Reports are filed. Governments publish their explanations. Newspapers move on to other stories. Eventually, the people who witnessed an event grow old, and many pass away. What remains is often whatever version of the story survived the longest. For decades, that appear to be exactly what would happen in the case of Czesław Kukuczka. A man died at a border crossing. Authorities explained why. The state endorsed that explanation. The case disappeared from public attention. At least, that is what many people likely assumed. Yet some stories possess an unusual ability to endure. Not because they are famous, not because they attract constant media attention, but because somewhere within them exists an unanswered question. The death of Czesław Kukuczka contained many such questions. Why had a firefighter from Poland traveled to East Berlin? Why had he felt compelled to resort to such a desperate act? Why had authorities chosen deception rather than a legal process? Why had a man carrying no real bomb ultimately been shot in the back? And why did the official story seem increasingly difficult to reconcile with the facts that emerged? Later, those questions lingered even when few people were asking them. In many ways, the case became a reflection of the broader history of the Cold War itself. The Cold War was filled with competing narratives. Governments claimed to protect freedom. Governments claimed to protect security. Governments claimed to act in the interests of ordinary citizens. Yet behind those claims existed countless personal stories that often revealed a far more complicated reality. The story of Kukuczka belongs to that category. It is not a story about military strategy. It is not a story about diplomats negotiating treaties. It is not a story about famous political leaders standing before cameras. Instead, it is a story about what happens when the ambitions of a state collide with the hopes of an individual. The imbalance between those forces is impossible to ignore. On one side stood an enormous security apparatus, an intelligence service, a bureaucracy, a political system determined to maintain control. On the other stood a single man. The outcome of that confrontation was never likely to be equal. Yet what makes the story remarkable is that the state's victory ultimately proved temporary. The shot fired at Friedrichstrasse succeeded in ending a life. It failed to permanently erase the truth. That distinction may seem subtle, but it matters. Throughout history, powerful institutions have often assumed that controlling information is equivalent to controlling reality. If documents can be altered, reality can be altered. If witnesses can be silenced, truth can be silenced. If records can be hidden, accountability can be hidden. The Kukuczka case demonstrates the limitations of that belief. The truth was delayed, but it was not destroyed. The file survived. Fragments of evidence survived. Memories survived. And eventually those pieces came together. Perhaps that is one reason the case continues to resonate long after the events themselves. People recognize something universal within it. Most individuals will never encounter the Stasi. Most individuals will never stand at a Cold War border crossing. Most individuals will never become subjects of secret government archives. Yet nearly everyone understands a desire to be heard. Nearly everyone understands the fear of being misrepresented. And nearly everyone understands the importance of having the truth acknowledged. For Kukuczka, that acknowledgement arrived far too late to benefit him personally. He never saw the Berlin Wall fall. He never witnessed German reunification. He never watched investigators uncover the documents that revealed what had happened. He never sat in the courtroom where the shooting would finally be examined. He never heard a judge reject the narrative that had defined his death for decades. Those moments belonged to history rather than to him. Yet they mattered nonetheless. Because historical truth is not only about the living, it is also about the dead. When historians reconstruct a forgotten event, they are not merely gathering information. They are restoring context. When investigators uncover hidden evidence, they are not merely solving a puzzle. They are correcting the record. And when courts acknowledge wrongdoing, they're doing more than assigning legal responsibility. They're affirming that some facts matter regardless of how much time has passed. In the years ahead, the name Czesław Kukuczka will probably never become as widely known as many other figures associated with the Cold War. His story lacks some of the elements that often dominate public memory. He was not a president. He was not a revolutionary leader. He was not the commander of a movement. He was an ordinary man. Yet perhaps that is precisely why the story remains powerful. History is often remembered through extraordinary people, but it is experienced primarily by ordinary ones. The Cold War shaped the lives of millions who never appeared in textbooks. People who worked ordinary jobs. People who raised families. People who worried about their futures. People who hoped for opportunities that seemed just beyond reach. Kukuczka represented one of those people. His life reminds us that political systems are ultimately measured not only by their institutions, but by their treatment of individuals. The details of his final day continue to carry symbolic weight. A man seeks a way out. He is told his request has been granted. He proceeds toward freedom. He believes the ordeal is ending. Instead, it ends his life. Even stripped of its political context, the sequence remains tragic. Within its historical context, it becomes something even more significant, a stark illustration of how state power could be exercised during one of the most divided periods of modern European history. And yet, if the shooting represents one ending, the investigation represents another. One narrative ends with a gunshot. The other ends with a courtroom. Between those two moments lies half a century. Half a century of silence. Half a century of unanswered questions. Half a century during which the official version stood largely unchallenged. The fact that the second ending eventually arrived at all is extraordinary. Not because it erased the first ending. Nothing can do that. But because it demonstrated that time does not always protect falsehood forever. The archives opened. The documents emerged. The story changed. And the man who had been portrayed as a terrorist came to be seen through a different lens. Not as the threat described by official reports, but as a desperate individual whose death had been deliberately misrepresented. That transformation may be the most important legacy of the entire case. Not the sentence, not the headlines, not even the conviction itself. The legacy is the restoration of reality. A correction made 50 years late is still a correction. A truth discovered after decades is still a truth. And a life remembered accurately is more meaningful than a life remembered through a lie. As this story closes, the image that remains is not the courtroom of 2024, nor the archives opened after the fall of East Germany. It is the image from 1974. A man moving forward. A border in front of him. A future he hopes to reach. He does not know what awaits him. He does not know that the promises made to him are false. He does not know that his name will one day appear in historical studies, legal proceedings, and documentaries examining the legacy of the Cold War. He knows only that he wants a chance at a different life. That desire is profoundly human, and perhaps that is why his story continues to endure. Not because it is a story about governments, not because it is a story about intelligence agencies, but because it is a story about a person whose final journey was interrupted. A person whose death was concealed. A person whose truth survived. And in the end, that truth became the one thing no border, no archive, and no government could permanently keep on the other side.